And in 1973, Philip Harner wrote an article and brought this into a discussion where the qualities of the noun are highlighted based on its position relative to the verb, specifically predicate nominatives. A Greek noun in the nominative case that's used as a predicate to describe a subject. So I go on to write in his article, Harner suggests, unlike Caldwell, that anarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb, such as theos in John 1:1c, may function primarily, listen to this, may function primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to express what? The nature or character of the subject. This is a big deal here. This is stealth, in my opinion. This is their attempt to really try to salvage John 1:1. Knowing all the controversy and problems from Caldwell and Caldwell's rule and assuming definiteness. Knowing that's a problem in itself, right? That they can't have the word identified as the God he's with, or as God in any definite sense, right? It has to be. Just like this. Harner says, unlike Caldwell, that anarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb may function to express the nature or character of the subject. Right? Well, wouldn't a predicate noun already do that? Isn't that the whole idea of a predicate noun? It's describing a subject. That's what a predicate noun does. No matter where it's used in the sentence. It's going to describe the subject and attribute to that subject a certain nature or character based on the noun that's used. But they're avoiding those kinds of descriptions, aren't they? It's just purely to this nature or character. And so where are they going with that? Well, Caldwell and other Trinitarians since him have tried to show that grammatically theos in John 1:1c is a definite noun, God. As noted above, Harner and other Trinitarians have put forth another way to understand theos, right? That it involves the placement of a noun like theos that is without the Greek article and that is in a certain word order, where the noun is before the verb. So where we translate John 1:1c, and the word was God or a God, right? The subject is first, the word, then the verb was, and then the predicate description, God or a God. In Greek, the word order can be different, and it can indicate certain things based on those differences. But does it limit whether a noun, when it's used as a predicate, indicates that the subject is an identifiable instance of that noun or one of the instances of that noun, and either way, therefore, having the qualities and nature of the noun as a predicate description? I think so. So they say in the case of John 1:1, I'm writing, but I'm talking about them. In the case of Trinitarians, in the case of the syntax of John 1:1c, this involves a form of the Greek verb to be, was. And then you have the predicate noun theos, right, preceding the verb. And so the Trinitarians are claiming that this now, since Harner, and at other times too, with translations like divine, right? But as you saw, and as we showed with Caldwell himself in promoting a definite view, God, capital G-O-D, he contrasted that specifically with divine. Even though, again, as I'm going to argue, he understands ultimately God, capital G-O-D, to mean divine, right? In the sense that it would be consistent with the Trinity. And whereas God, capital G, as a definite translation, would not. And that's why they're moving away from Caldwell, even though he understands it basically the same way. Just grammatically different. And then I go on to explain, as I wrote in chapter 2, I talked more about these issues. For Trinitarians, what it means to be theos has to do with understanding the use of theos for any person of the Trinity to involve each one sharing fully. Remember, Harner, right here. Anarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb may function primarily to express the nature or character of the subject, right? So that's what I'm talking about. For Trinitarians, what it means to be theos has to do with understanding the use of theos for any person of the Trinity, to involve each one sharing fully and equally in the nature of the Trinity. They're one God. No one person of the Trinity is this one God. And yet we have throughout the Bible instances where the Father and to some extent the sons, referred to as God or as a God, and gods, of course. Psalm 82, John 10. The Father alone is described as the one God. Ultimately, what this means is that whether a Trinitarian tries to use Caldwell's rule to argue that theos in John 1:1c is definite, or use Harner's study to argue that theos really only expresses the nature or character of the subject, no matter what, like I've been talking about and like I wrote about a while ago. This is my third edition. This is my earlier editions as well. No matter what grammatical label a Trinitarian gives to theos in John 1:1c or to theos anywhere else, it cannot identify Jesus definitively as the Trinity or as the Father, as a person of the Trinity, John 1:1b, however a Trinitarian sees that, but only as a divine person of the Trinity, or person of the Trinity, of course, divine person. In other words, Trinitarianism is assumed by Trinitarians in their interpretation of John 1:1, no matter what kind of noun theos is in John 1:1c, or even in 1:1b, or anywhere else in the NT when theos is used of Jesus or of the Father. And I talk about more on those pages. But this is what I've been talking about, right? I wrote about this a while ago, and I've been consistently explaining it ever since. Even though Harner is arguing for a Trinitarian understanding of John 1:1, Jehovah's Witnesses and CWJs have cited Harner's article several times in various publications. We haven't necessarily cited, but I've cited, of course, and I'm doing it right here, and I'm CWJ, but also JW, so I represent them both, I guess, in that sense, right? But not with the Watchtower, so I won't speak for them, but I will defend where necessary. Jehovah's Witnesses have cited Harner's article several times in various publications when defending the NWT and its rendering a God, for example, and then they cite Harner here, quote from the NWT. What, though, does Harner mean by qualitative? In the quotation made here in the 1984 reference edition of the NWT. Because Harner in that quotation states from his article, there's no basis for regarding the predicate theos in John 1:1c as definite, contrary to Caldwell. He says, in John 1:1, I think that the qualitative force of the predicate theos is so prominent that the noun can't be regarded as definite. He doesn't say it can't be regarded as indefinite, though, right? But he doesn't say it can be, right? See how they act? They can't have it as indefinite, so they don't even bring that up. And they can't have it as definite, and that's they're trying to deal with Caldwell, so that's specifically what they're targeting. But they leave it in this qualitative zone, right? Which is what he was talking about earlier, to express the nature or character of the subject. Because they're assuming the Trinity. Right? They're not looking at it the way the Bible uses gods, like Jesus in John 10. God calls the other sons of God gods. He uses that in his defense when they're accusing him of claiming to be theos. Same thing as we're reading about in John 1:1c, right, without the article. So our understanding is entirely consistent, and even with Jesus' own defense. They don't believe that, though. They don't believe Jesus is one of the sons of God who was with God in the beginning. Not as a God. Not like, separate from the Father in a non-Trinitarian sense. That's why they're talking about the nature. That's why they're getting away from this definite. But even if they understand it as definite, right? If they are a Trinitarian, ultimately they understand John 1:1c, the word was God, capital G-O-D, as him having the nature of God, being fully God. They don't understand that to mean definite in the sense that he's identified as God, even though they've taught that for a long time in many ways. All right, so what, though, does Harner mean by qualitative? Well, before I answer that question, I explain what Harner means by and why he objects to viewing theos as a definite noun. And I state here in what follows, I underline two extremely important comments Harner makes in connection with his understanding of the grammar of John 1:1c. So I want you to pay attention, okay? I know we've been going for a little while, but we won't be going for that much longer. And this is important stuff. We all knew we had to take a little time to get into these issues. I believe my writings provide the best map to use, at least to go over the stuff I've already talked about. And I'm going to get into a few other things in just a moment related to this. All right, so let's look at this quote that I give from Harner's article and the parts I highlighted and see what it has to say. Commentators on the fourth gospel, this is Harner, Trinitarian, arguing against a definite translation of God in John 1:1c, but nonetheless believing in the Trinity and in a qualitative view of theos in John 1:1c. This is what Harner says. Commentators on the fourth gospel, as far as I know, have not specifically approached the meaning of this clause from the standpoint of the qualitative force of theos, as an anarthrous predicate preceding the verb. In many cases, their interpretations agree with the explanation that is given above. But consideration of the qualitative meaning of theos would lend further clarification and support. You see, he knows. He knows, just like Bowman knows, just like they all know, that while they're not quite all getting it right on the grammatical side, it doesn't matter. On the theological side, it never changes for them. No matter whether it's John 1:1, Titus 2:13, John 20:20, it doesn't matter. We'll get to them all, and I've already talked about them all. But I'm referencing texts we haven't got to specifically in videos, so we'll get to them. But they're all the same in the Trinitarian understanding. Contextually different, grammatically different. The understanding's the same. None of the persons are ever being identified as God entirely, apart from the others. And they're never being identified as an indefinite God. They're always being identified fully as God, having the nature of God, no matter what. Right? So the grammar is really ignored in every case, and the Trinitarian is what takes precedence. They'll use the grammar as a shield. It doesn't really do much, though, unless it just keeps you at bay and you don't really see what they're doing with it. But that's why we're having this discussion. So Harner's he's trying to bring clarity to the Trinitarian presentation of this text. So he says, for example, J.H. Bernard points out that Codex L reads hatheos instead of theos. It's like a 9th century Greek text that uses hatheos in John 1:1c, versus theos like all the early texts, P66, P75. But this, he continues, would contradict the preceding clause. That's why they don't really promote the Codex L reading of hatheos. In a similar way, W.H. Howard writes that theos and halagos are not interchangeable. Otherwise, he continues, the writer could not say the word was with God, just like we've been talking about. Both writers, in effect, are arguing that the predicate theos cannot be regarded as definite in this clause, 1:1c. In terms of our analysis above, this would mean that clause B should not be assimilated to clause A. And then I go on to write. What Harner means when he says clause B should not be assimilated to clause A is that we should not understand John's use of theos in reference to the word as interchangeable with that of ton theon, or hatheos in the nominative, in John 1:1b, the God with whom the word existed. See, they don't believe they're interchangeable, no matter what understanding. It's just that the definite understanding of God as capital G-O-D in John 1:1c is a problem for them. Because that could mean that it's interchangeable with the definite theos in John 1:1b. So they see the problem, but the Trinity is what keeps them from solving it. Well, in one sense, it solves it for them, but not in a biblical sense, right? It's the opposite of what Bowman writes about. He writes that a God is possible only in a pagan context, and that's actually the biblical understanding. John 10, Psalm 82, all the texts. Whereas the Trinitarian understanding has nothing to do with the Bible in its developed metaphysicality, right? The way they understand this nature of God in three persons and all that stuff, that's not in the Bible. They bring it to the Bible and use it to interpret the Bible like you see right now. Right? So they can't have that identification. That's why the whole God translation is a problem for them. It's making Trinitarians think they're interchangeable. And it's confusing their understanding of the Trinity for many of them. It causes a problem. So even Trinitarian scholars realize that Trinitarians are having a problem with God. Now, because they know Trinitarians, just like with Caldwell, okay, think Caldwell. Even though Caldwell was arguing for a definite translation, right, God, capital G-O-D, he still believed in the Trinity, right? He didn't really believe that the Son was the Father or that the Son was the Trinity. He just didn't understand what the implications were of his argument or of his view, right? So it's the same with other Trinitarians. Other Trinitarians who aren't like the Trinitarians that are more aware of the qualitative necessity of theos in the sense that they don't have to have a definite or indefinite application that would contradict the Trinity. Most Trinitarians, it doesn't matter, right? You'll still see Trinitarians today, even in, I believe, Martin's editions of the Kingdom of the Cults, right? So they're reading the things we read earlier that show a misrepresentation, a failure to understand, and a misquotation, really, right? Never versus usually, Martin on Caldwell. They're still reading that stuff. So you still get Trinitarians today who quote Caldwell, who believe it's definite, right? It's just so much embedded in their thinking that even though many Trinitarians are trying to kind of help explain it better, they're still seeing it as a definite translation, and some think of it definitely. But ultimately, even with their understanding of John 1:1c as God in a definite sense, they still break it down fundamentally in a Trinitarian way. It breaks from that definite identification that they believe is correct because just not understanding it correctly, the grammar of the text, and how to classify it right, even according to how they understand it. They still devolve into the nature of God understanding. So most Trinitarians, I believe, as scholars, they're not as worried. Probably be more of a problem for them if they changed capital G-O-D at this point, right? So in one sense, they might just keep reinforcing that translation and then the understanding that it still means he's fully God. Right? Because there's other texts, like I said, Titus 2:13, where Jesus in their view is called God. And so they're not going to be able to get out of this entirely. Their only real hope is just to not have people understand what they're doing and to keep accepting the Trinity that they assume is part of their beliefs. And so when they get to Titus 2:13 or a translation of John 1:1 that has God, capital G-O-D, they're going to still read it as a Trinitarian, right? They're not going to see a problem with it being a definite capital G-O-D, the great God, or God, capital G-O-D. Not usually. It's still going to be devolved into the metaphysicality of the Trinity. So it's really just a translation problem for them, or an appearance problem. It's a big problem if it's broken down like we are, and we call them on it, and we say, wait a minute. No. You're arguing for this. For example, Titus 2:13 has the article, John 1:1c, he's with the God, the definite God, the known God from Genesis 1. He can't be that God. He has to be a different God than the God in John 1:1b, therefore a God. Titus 2:13, there's not another God mentioned right there with him, but he's definitely called God if you believe it. Sharp's rule applies there. And so you have the same problem you have in John 1:1. Right? If he's definitely identified as God, it's an identification of that individual, Jesus, as God, not as one with the nature of God, right? We're assuming the Trinity there. So he can't be the same God as any other God if he's the great God of Titus 2:13. He's called the God there, or the God, identifying him definitively as a God or the God of Titus 2:13. And that's why it goes on in John 1:18 to describe the Word as an only begotten God, or the uniquely begotten God. Something that the Father is not described as, but again identified as God, the only begotten God, the monogenes theos God. We'll talk about that text more later in this series. Let's finish up, though, this part here in my writing. So again, they see that as a contradiction. They can't have the clauses be identifying each other. Notice, however, that Harner points out that even those who have not argued for a qualitative sense for theos in John 1:1c have given the same explanation Harner gives, regardless of their grammatical understanding of theos and 1.1c. This explanation is none other than the Trinitarianism expressed by Bruce Vaughan and quoted with approval by Harner, namely, the Word is divine, but he is not all of divinity, for he has already been distinguished from what? What does Harner say in quoting Bruce Vaughan? Distinguished from what? The Word is divine, right? Theos without the article. They see it as qualitative, but not all of divinity, for he has already been distinguished from what or whom? Another divine person. Trinity. They just took not only theos for the Word as divine in a Trinitarian sense, right? Because another person. This is the first one. The second one is the one he's already been distinguished from. John 1:1b. I told you, didn't I, that it doesn't matter whether the article is used, whether it's John 1:1b, whether it's Titus 2:13, whether it's an anarthrous predicate nominative preceding the verb like John 1:1c. Look, right here, you have Harner quoting with approval another Trinitarian Vaughan, interpreting John 1:1c as the Word is divine in a Trinitarian sense, as we can prove by another person right there. But 1:1b, ha theos in the nominative, ton theon in the accusative, they do the same thing. Right there and everywhere. But, I mean, this is it, right? Black and white. Right there, they've taken 1:1b, which isn't an anarthrous predicate noun. It's an articulated noun that is the object of the preposition pros, right? Word was with the God. They don't care. That might as well have been an anarthrous predicate nominative in John 1:1b, right? For that, it doesn't make any difference. It's another divine person. Do you see what they're doing? They're doing it everywhere. Every time the word God is used, even in the Old Testament. Sometimes they might see it as the Trinity, but it's all assumption. It's all their beliefs right back into the text. Right here, look at it. Harner, quoting Vaughan, in explaining why they have to see theos in John 1:1c as qualitative, contra Caldwell, is because they can't have theos in John 1:1c be all of divinity. What's all of divinity? According to them, the person, the divine person, the Word has been distinguished from in John 1:1b. Setting aside, all of divinity, right? Whether or not they mean in John 1:1b that that's the Trinity or the divine nature or the Father. Right here, it says another divine person, so it has to mean the Father there. The Word is divine, but not all of divinity, because he's already been distinguished from another divine person. They see John 1:1b, ha theos ton theon, as divine person. That the Word cannot be. And that if it's a definite translation like God, in the beginning was the Word was with God, capital G-O-D, and the Word was God, capital G-O-D, they see that as leading to this contradiction or identification of the two persons, Father and Son, of the Trinity. But it's not. It's the Father as the God that everyone knows from Genesis 1, with the Word as a God, as one of the sons of God that Jesus refers to from Psalm 82 in his defense in John 10. they're assuming the Trinity for every use of God. John 1:1b, John 1:1c, you name it. Like I said, Titus 2:13, John 20:28. They cannot have the Word or Jesus or the Father as anything other than a divine person of the assumed Trinity. So it does not matter. They'll argue for it and they'll try to convince you that the grammar makes it more likely that what they're saying is correct, but they're assuming the Trinity no matter what. And their grammatical arguments are not correct. Here the word is assumed to be theos only as a divine person. We just read it. It's right there. Emphasized. You can read it on your own. They do it all the time. What Harner has tried to do, and what many Trinitarians since him have done where it concerns John 1:1c, is to line up their theological assumptions with their grammatical understanding of the text. Harner refers to R.E. Brown, another Trinitarian scholar, who regards the translation, the word was God, as correct for a Christian reader whose Trinitarian background has accustomed him to thinking of God as a larger concept than God the Father. See, they have a larger concept than God, the one God being the Father. We don't. Our concept of the one God is the Father. That's what the text says in plain language. 1 Corinthians 8:6. So when we see him with the God of Genesis 1, yeah, we believe that's the Father, the one God. We don't have this larger concept, this Trinitarian background that R.E. Brown is saying you need to have. Of course you do. Without a Trinitarian assumption informing you before you get to the text, you won't know what's going on. Right? So there we have it. A Trinitarian background is necessary in order to avoid misunderstanding the translation the word was God. Or even divine. But more so God, right? Because that could lead to the problem with Trinitarians identifying the God of 1:1c or the person of 1:1c as the person of 1:1b. We just read it in Harner quoting Botter. So Trinitarians' greater problem has to do with their acceptance of HaTheos and 1:1b as definite. The reason this is a problem is because any definite use of theos in the Bible would have to refer to the Trinity, not the Father. Right? Because there's only one God to the Trinitarians, the Trinity. As a person of the theos, for there's only one theos in Trinitarianism, the Trinity. Yet, according to Bowman, for JWs to translate God is in one sense grammatically possible, but only if we adopt a pagan interpretation of John 1:1, which we know it's just the opposite, right? That's what they're doing. Non-biblical in any case. And whereas ours is directly rooted in the Bible, the very position and argument that Jesus himself uses in John 10.